By the end of this video, I want you to understand the three main and basic destroyers of modern society nowadays, especially among young people in their teens, 20s, and maybe even 30s in some cases. But first, as always, subscribe and stick on to the end to implement these tips and tricks into your life. Now, the first main and basic destroyer that I think is hurting people in modern society is TikTok. Now, I recently did a video on TikTok, but I feel like there were still a few things, despite the video being quite long for this channel, I still feel there were a few things that I did miss out. But obviously, if you didn't watch that video, I'm going to go through some of the things that I did mention in that video as well, just to sort of summarize it in a way. But there are a few obvious things that TikTok and short form content in general does to people. Obviously, it decreases their attention span and screws with their dopamine. The amount of sort of overstimulating graphics that are there on TikTok and short form content in general means people become so distracted when they actually try to focus on anything in real life. For instance, it could be their studying. People may struggle to study and focus on writing the facts and figures down that they need to remember because they're so distracted by the stuff that they previously watched on TikTok that completely screwed with their attention span. I mean, there's data statistics that say humans' attention span is actually a lot less than a goldfish nowadays, and we use the attention span of a goldfish as an insult to these little kids who watch so much TikTok and get distracted really easily. Yet they don't even have that. They have less than the attention span of a goldfish, and that is incredibly worrying when you consider that these kids are going to be the future of modern society. And that's why I say that TikTok and the other stuff that I'm going to mention in this video are the three destroyers of modern society. And while it may seem quite conspiracy, almost like, I do think that they're not maybe going to cause societal collapse, but in the long term, they're probably going to have much bigger of an impact than you may probably think. And while the common attention span and sort of dopamine problems that TikTok can give, where you every time you sort of scroll through a video, your dopamine will spike because of the graphics, and then it will sort of dip again, and then you sort of just have to, it keeps on just cycling and cycling until your dopamine is so low that means that you have to scroll and indulge in addictions that give you dopamine because your dopamine is so low. But the problem is those addictions end up making your dopamine even lower than what it is before, and it's quite a vicious cycle that our body puts itself through, and it's not a nice thing, and it's very, very common and very, very easy to happen with things like TikTok. As I say, it does go a lot deeper than just this sort of dopamine and attention span. Many young kids develop ADHD symptoms because they spend too much time on TikTok and short form content in general. You know the sort of young kids that watch a lot of YouTube shorts with the sort of Subway Surfers and Minecraft parkour in the background. All these distracting sort of overstimulating graphics ends up giving children ADHD symptoms and maybe even developing ADHD completely if they watch TikTok and stuff at too young of an age. And it's very worrying that this sort of stuff is happening. People are actually developing long-term, permanent almost consequences of the fact that TikTok just has such overstimulating stuff, and it's all the 1 minute, 10-second long videos that just completely screw with and fry our dopamine receptors. But ADHD isn't even the only problem. Tourette's, which is a syndrome where you sort of impulsively will do things that you may not have wanted to do. The common sort of thing that happens with Tourette's is many people will involuntarily shout words that they didn't really intend to shout out, and these can be bad words, these can be just any kind of words in general, and people have developed Tourette's with their phones. People will instinctively, impulsively pick up their phones because their brain is so low on dopamine. They will pick up their phones and start scrolling because they just need that quick dopamine, but the problem is, in the end, is that quick dopamine will end up meaning that when they finish scrolling, their dopamine is going to completely crash and fall and burn, and they're going to end up having this impulsive sort of thing, Tourette's again. And this can happen when you're trying to study. It's happened to me a few times. When I was studying for my GCSEs, sometimes I'd impulsively sort of reach for my phone and just start looking at YouTube or whatever because I had deleted a lot of social media by that time. But short form content in general is just quite a bad thing for society, and I really do advise you to stringently avoid it at all costs. But yeah, even me, I impulsively used to reach for my phone to scroll, and now I end up just, if I'm trying to study or do some work on my computer, I'll just chuck my phone to the other side of the room, and therefore I won't impulsively try to climb over my bed and go all the way there just to grab my phone and scroll. That's not something that I do personally, but the problem is so many people are so deprived of actual good delayed gratification dopamine that they may even sort of impulsively jump to the other side of their bedroom and just start scrolling because their brain is so bored or whatever. And while these sort of problems apply to all short form content, YouTube Shorts, Instagram Reels, TikTok, Snapchat, all that sort of stuff, while this applies to all short form content, there are things that TikTok alone does that is just bad for society in general. And the one main thing is data leaks. You may have heard the sort of conspiracy theories on the news about TikTok and it being China and now they know where you live and all that sort of stuff. But while that may not be to the extent of what they sort of talk about, while that may not, while it may not be as bad as the fact that they now know where you live and all that sort of stuff, they probably do still buy data from other companies, which means that they will recommend you videos that are so well suited to you and that you will find entertaining in a way that means that you will carry on scrolling and get hooked and get hooked. Your dopamine will crash and burn when you exit the app, and then you'll go back on the app and get hooked and get hooked and get hooked. And while this sort of data selling may seem like a conspiracy theory, I think to an extent it's definitely true, and they probably do end up getting data from things like Netflix and stuff, because that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about. A few of the times where my sister or me have watched a Netflix show or something, which I personally don't do very much, but I know a lot of other people do. Many people will then find that sort of edits or something, little edits or clips of that show will appear on their TikTok pages or the short form content pages, even on cases like Instagram and stuff, a lot more often than what they previously did. And that kind of shows that maybe they do buy things like data off of Netflix to see what shows you're watching, because you may have like an email linked to both the TikTok and Netflix account or whatever, and this means that they'll recommend you edits and stuff from that show that will keep you hooked. And while there are things like the data leaks on TikTok, it screws with your attention spans and has health deficits, there also the stuff on TikTok just simply provides zero value to people other than to procrastinate and to just distract themselves from their thoughts. And that is quite a big problem. The stuff on TikTok, the 10-second, 1 second, not even yet, 1 second or so clips, 1 minute clips, provide no real value, and you are physically unable to really get much value out of these videos, especially when they're sort of filled with the little text boxes and overstimulating graphics. You're not really able to get much value out of it. And yeah, it just means that it's hard to explain. I've never really used TikTok much, but I have used other short form content platforms, and it's just not a fun thing to do. It's just a waste of time, and I hate social media. Simple as, to be honest, because when you scroll on social media, you end up scrolling on social media when you are quite bored as a person, and scrolling on social media essentially becomes your new bored. People will be bored while scrolling on social media, since when we were kids, when we used to have nothing to do, we just sort of lie there and moan and groan at our parents for not having anything to do. But now we just sort of are bored, but we're still like literally scrolling on TikTok while lying on the floor moaning and groaning because we're bored. And that just shows the sort of development in our screwed dopamine and attention span levels over the course of our lifetimes, especially for many people who have been using short form content for maybe around 10 years or so now. And the second thing that I think is a main and basic destroyer of modern society is vaping. And now, while this doesn't really apply to people who use vaping to help quit smoking and to kind of get off sort of nicotine addictions in general, this mostly applies to people who are my age, people who are under 18 and in their 20s who just vape a lot. And I did a recent video on vaping which talked about how so many people who are even younger than me, who are like 11 and 8 years old, are still quite addicted to vapes. And I feel like I still missed a few things about vaping in that video. And one of the main things was that vaping is like an introductory drug. While many people use it to help recover from smoking addictions, and then they kind of progressively overload, like they go from smoking to vaping to just nothing. Many people use, like who are young people who are under 18s, they use vaping as sort of the introductory drug and the step up to doing things like smoking and stuff at parties. And that's just from my observation of people who I know. And yeah, it just seems like that's sort of the way that things work nowadays. People will start vaping at parties when they're like young, maybe 12, 13, 14, and then they'll end up smoking and doing far worse drugs down the line. Because I got a comment on this video which said that they know many 11-year-olds which do even worse things than vaping, which is still probably true and is quite sad, but I still feel like the fact is vaping is, for the majority of cases, the introductory drug. It's the thing that people do first, and if an 8-year-old starts getting hooked onto vaping from being introduced by their brother or something, then maybe by the time they're 11, they are doing worse drugs that give them a better high or whatever. And yes, that is quite a big issue when you consider that these kids are like 11 and are going to die incredibly prematurely because of all the chemicals and stuff that is being inhaled by their lungs. Yeah, the fact that so many kids are going to end up dying prematurely because they vape too much is kind of why I decided to make this one of the main destroyers of society, because it's going to leave people like me and people who don't really vape all that often in the future with just a lot of stuff to have to do, because society's not going to have many people who are my age in the future, when you consider that vaping and stuff does have a lot of obviously quite bad and cancer-causing and carcinogenic chemicals that do get absorbed into our bloodstream. There was a recent statistic that I saw that said there were almost 700 or so synthetic chemicals in our bodies and in our bloodstream, and while personally that may be less for me because I don't do things like vaping, etc., I felt like where people who do vape, that could potentially be even more, because there's so many different flavorings from stuff from all the different... It's so complicated, and it's just sad in general. And if you are currently vaping and are under 18 or like haven't really started smoking yet either, I highly recommend you do try to put in the effort to stop. And even if you are using it as smoking recovery, that's fair enough that you're doing that. But also, I do recommend to not just stay on that forever, and do try to progressively overload off vaping and onto nothing to be able to live your healthiest and your best life. And the third and final thing that I think is going to be the main and basic destroyer of people in modern society is porn. And you've probably heard of the things on self-improvement spaces. This is quite commonly talked about, is that so many young people, like 8-year-olds, are addicted and have viewed this sort of stuff. It's not... this shouldn't be the case, to be honest, because it screws with their brain in so many ways more than just dopamine addictions. It just screws with their overall perception of the world in general. And while it does do many bad things to the dopamine and stuff inside their brain, many researchers have shown that porn and stuff does really do a lot of bad things to the brain. And this kind of addictions and stuff, your brain is chemically and physically altered when you use this stuff far, far, far too often, which is often the case because so many people who are young don't really understand the sort of deficits of this stuff and are just chronically addicted, when realistically they shouldn't even know what this stuff actually even is. And while it can also screw with their brain, especially if they are very young, it can also screw with other parts of their body as well. If people get addicted and like access this sort of stuff before they even hit puberty, it's going to screw with their development as well, because they're using this stuff multiple times a day, and it just doesn't end well for these kids who are 8. It just, yeah, I'm lost for words in a way, because it doesn't... This is why I say for many things I'm lost for words in a lot of these sort of TikTok, vaping and porn, that kind of stuff, because they are going to have a massive impact on our society when you consider that so many kids are just ruined completely by things like TikTok, vaping and porn. And it does not bode well for the future of our planet and the future of the people who are inside this planet. Because the fact is, these kids don't really know any better. It's sort of an inherent desire, in a way, to actually be able to do this sort of stuff. It is biological, it is just what happens naturally. But the main problem is accessibility. With a tap of a keyboard, these kids can see so many gruesome things just within a matter of minutes or seconds, and that's going to completely screw with their future, and they don't really even understand it. And I do think that this, along with other things like TikTok and vaping, need to be stopped and need to be changed. And while there may be worse things that exist out there in the world, the fact is, it's almost like a pyramid. The majority of people do watch TikTok and do vape and do watch porn, and like that's gonna... Because these things are still quite bad, while there may be a tiny slim amount of people who do a lot worse things than that, there are still loads of people who do this kind of stuff, and obviously we know it's not good for them, we know it's not healthy. And, I mean, the majority of these kids don't even really know and understand that. And that's one of the main problems as well, is just sort of ignorance and a lack of education for, like, 8-year-old kids. But realistically, should these kids even need education? The fact they're exposed to this kind of stuff through things like TikTok, because TikTok's quite an over-sexualized platform. They're exposed to this sort of stuff through TikTok and through social media and through school. And, yeah, it's just, yeah... And this also applies to things like gore and stuff. People with a tap of a keyboard, they'll go on Twitter and they'll just look at gore, and it's just gruesome and disgusting and horrible for kids who are like so young, because this stuff is so accessible on the internet nowadays. And yeah, that's about it, to be honest. I can't really think of many other things to say that I hate about all the sort of stuff that I mentioned in this video, because realistically, they're going to have a bad impact on our society in the future, and I hope there are many things that we can do in the future to mitigate their impacts and completely kill the root cause and source of this sort of stuff. So with that, I hope you found value out this video, and if you have watched to the end, thank you very much. I really appreciate that, because I do put a lot of work into these videos, and I also recommend subscribing because I like this community of young tribal people who are willing to improve themselves so much more than they already have, and good luck.